Hey there, After Effects folks, it's Felt Tips here again with a tip for you called How to Render. One of the most asked questions in After Effects forums and so on, and on VideoHive too. How do I render this? How do I render that? Well, what I'm going to show you now is not necessarily everything to do with rendering. That would be a long tutorial. And of course implicit in that is not only an understanding of After Effects, but an understanding of all the possible formats and compressions and so on and so forth that are possible to use. And believe me, there are hundreds of them. So what I'm going to show you today is the kind of method that I've come to for rendering and previewing. After about 15 years of using After Effects, I sort of settled on this as the best way I could think of to work. Okay, now of course rendering well and rendering kind of, how do you say, economically fast, whatever, as fast as you can, is going to come into its own when you are working on a long and tricky render. So I have made this little composition here called Long and Tricky to Render. Let's just have a quick preview of this and see what it looks like. Okay, so there we are, there's the animation. And although this project isn't actually particularly long or tricky to render, even previewing those sort of 220 odd frames at half resolution with motion blur took around about 5 minutes. So do you know what I mean? If you're constantly previewing a project, I'm talking about previewing now rather than rendering, if you're constantly previewing and every time it's going to take you that amount of time, 5 minutes, you're going to slow down the speed that you're able to work at. So before we actually look at rendering, I'm just going to very quickly look at a few sort of previewing issues. Well, the first and the most obvious is when you're dealing with movement and you want to see how something moves and flows, you don't need to be able to see full resolution. With this, I would probably most likely be inclined to come down to quarter, or you could even go lower. You could go down to kind of 1/8 resolution like that. That's perhaps a little bit too low, so let's stick with a quarter. I'm also going to turn motion blur off, and let's just see how we do there in terms of rendering. Now I sped the last render up obviously so as to not waste anyone's time, but this one's now rendering in real time. And I would say that that is, we're just coming to the end of it now. Let's let that play. I'd say that's more like 20-30 seconds instead of 5-6 minutes. And okay, it doesn't look quite as nice without the motion blur on, but we can see perfectly well what's going on there. Personally, I also like to build things in. I've got a little bit of an expression on this as well, where I can actually click on this text and switch into edit mode, which just sort of temporarily makes everything 2.5D. You can see that goes even faster. So for playing around with my movement, for working out the animation on things and so on, it's a very good idea to work as kind of minimally as you possibly can. And then only when you come to doing your final render, or your final checking and final render, to switch everything on. Now also another thing in terms of previewing, before we move on to rendering, in your RAM preview options here, Command 3 or Control 3 on a PC, you've got this little skip function here. Auto resolution renders in whatever resolution you have set over here, so you can always look at your stills in half and preview it a quarter. And I've actually set skip to 1 on there. Now what that does is render every other frame. So what happens is your movement isn't as smooth, temporally speaking, but it only takes half the amount of time to render, and there you can see. Not a way I particularly like to preview things, because I find that you lose the sense of the movement somewhat. But, you know, if you've got simpler kind of movement, then that's a very good thing to do. And you'll notice that rendered in quarter resolution, even though I have a half set in the preview window. If I put it to auto, then it'll render, it'll preview in the resolution I have set here. Good. Now let's move on to rendering. And the first rule, my rule if you like, of rendering is render as an image sequence. Regardless of what you want in the end, regardless of what your client wants in the end, they may want a QuickTime, they may want a Flash movie, they may want an AVI, it doesn't matter. Whilst I'm working on a project, I render everything as an image sequence. Now why is that? Well, the problem is if you render a QuickTime movie of something, and then say, like you have here, a 900 frame animation, And your client comes back the following day and says, okay, well, we want to change the background color between frames 100 and 200. Well, you've then got a choice. You can either render the whole QuickTime movie again, or you can just render the section between 100 and 200 again. But if you do that, you then need to make a new project or a new composition where you import all of the parts and you kind of lay the new rendered bit over the right part of the old rendered bit and then render it out again. Which, when you're in a hurry and it's late at night and you're tired and can make mistakes, it's all a bit of a hassle. It's quite a lot of things to keep in mind. If you're using an image sequence, on the other hand, when you re-render the part from 100 to 200, you don't have to do any sort of patching. You don't need to re-import and put things all in the right place. You just simply overwrite the files that you wrote in the first place. Let me demonstrate. For instance, we've got this project, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to render it out with nothing on it. We're just going to turn all of the layers visibility off, like so. And I'm going to go to Composition, Make Movie, go to Render, and I'm going to call it comp1.mov. That's the default setting is as a MOV. And then I'm going to change that to a TIFF sequence. Now you may not have TIFF sequence as a preset in your output module. If not, come down to Make Template. I'll make a new one. I'll call it TIFF Sequence 2. Hit Edit, and under Format, change to TIFF Sequence. I generally stick with RGB unless I'm doing sort of pre-renders and interim renders. You can decide on that. Under Format Options, I generally use LZW compression. That's a kind of a zip compression that's lossless. Obviously no audio options with an image sequence, so let's OK all that. And now we have TIFF Sequence 2 selected, and it's an option under our output modules. You'll also notice here that the name of the file has changed, that we have a square bracket and then 4 hash signs and another square bracket. In the final thing, that will actually be replaced with a number, a padded number, so the first frame will be 0000 and 0001 and so on and so forth. And you'll notice there's actually a little option under the output module to use the comp frame number, which you can override and start at a different frame number if you prefer. Okay, so once that's done, I'm just going to hit render. And because there are no layers on this, you can see how fast this is rendering. Okay, once that's done, I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call it render. Let's call it the render. Sounds a bit more like a film title, doesn't it? And I'm going to import that image sequence just by clicking on the first frame, or in actual fact any frame of that sequence, making sure TIFF sequence is selected down here, and then clicking open. That will come in. And then I'm going to drag it down into a composition. I'm going to name the composition Versioner. Double click the composition and you'll see there's the sequence that we just rendered out. Everything is black, nothing in there just yet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Make Movie, and I'm going to select a photo JPEG 75 QuickTime that I'm going to scale down to 640 by 360, because that is what our client has asked for. And then I'm going to render that out into a folder called Versions. QT640. And then we can render that one through. Now what that means is before we've even started work on our project, we have our entire render chain set up. We have our interim image sequence, and we have our client's final sort of QuickTime 640 by 360 for approval. So there we go, and if we come into our Finder, we can go into Versions and we can find our QT640, and sure enough, a 30-second animation with just black. Now at this point you're thinking, huh? Black animation? What's going on? Well, let me show you. Now you've got that all set up, all you have to do is turn your layers on and you do a little bit of work on your project. And suppose you're working initially on frames sort of 100 through to 149. Now, if you come up here and say Composition Make Movie, you go to that TIFF sequence setting and you make sure that it's rendering into the render folder. You'll notice it has the same name. We hit render, Okay, and as soon as that's rendered, come back into our project and we go into Versioner. Now as we scroll along, we'll find those frames that we've just rendered have been updated, and you're beginning to see the principle. Now all you would need to do is go back to your render queue, duplicate up the Versioner, make sure you're overwriting that Qt640 file, re-render, and you've got a version with your updates made to it. Now this is really useful because clients like to just correct a little bit of a project. So every time you do this, you've got a really quick method, without having to really do very much work, of showing what the updates are. Now, that brings me on to my next issue. Supposing I've got the piece of animation just like I want it between frames 0 and 249, and I want to carry on with some extra kind of animation between frames 500 and 600. Well, that's where something else comes into the equation, and that something else is the amazing BG Renderer script from AEScript by author Lloyd Alvarez. Now you can download that from aescripts.com. It's a name-your-own-price file, which means that you don't have to pay anything for it, but there is a suggested price of $20 for you. You can pay whatever you want to. But Lloyd has put, I know, a lot of work into this, and it's a great script. It is the biggest time saver in After Effects. So if you do download it and do use it, make a nice little donation to the guy. I've already got it installed. It's actually a rather older version, but it still does the job. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a render, make movie like this, set it to my TIFF sequence 2, make sure that we're rendering into the render folder and that we're overwriting the old files. And instead of hitting render, what I'm going to do is going to come up to File, Scripts, choose Background Renderer. Making sure that I have multiprocessing enabled, I'm going to hit Background Render, yes. And that brings up a terminal window. What it's doing at the moment is it's just launching all of the instances of the After Effects render engine in the background. And once it's done that, it's just going to sit there rendering away to itself, rendering out all my frames. The joy of this is I can pop back into my After Effects, go back into Comp 1, and I can carry on working on my animation over here and, you know, making all sorts of changes to it if I feel like it. You know, if I did want to turn my text completely upside down, for instance. But the real joy of this is that when you come back into your versioner, you now see that those frames are actually updating as they're rendering in the background. So you can see at the moment we're up to frame, where are we up to? Frame 62 or so, which that corresponds to what's going on here. You can see there's more frames being rendered out now. Now we're up to frame 66. Well, if we just do edit and purge all, you'll now see that those frames are updating. My versioner animation for rendering out to the client and for looking at my rendered animation is updating as it renders in the terminal in the background. So that's a wonderful thing in terms of workflow. This really kind of enables you to just keep the whole process going when you're under time and under pressure with deadlines to meet. Now, I'm going to scroll forward in time a little bit to a point where the project is almost complete, and we'll show you how that works in another context. Okie doke, we are now forwards in time. We have our animation finished. Let's have a quick look. I'm looking at this in the versioner now, so I'm just quickly doing a preview render through of our finished animation. And there you go, that'll do. And there it is, that's all ready to render out for our client. And then the client comes back and they say, well, we really love it, but what we want to do is to change the section between 100 and 200 frames to have, ping, a different background color. Okay, that's a little bit annoying. But using our new technique, we can say to ourselves, that doesn't mean we have to render out the whole thing again. All we need to do is set our First frame at 100, our last frame at 199. That's right. And we've got the whole of the new section. All we have to do is go to Make Movie, set our TIFF sequence to, once again, make sure that we're rendering out to the render folder where we'll be overwriting that other stuff, and then so that we can carry on making any other changes that we want to do, we can go and run our background renderer script to render that in the background. Supposing though that the client has said, well, we want to see this really, really quickly. One other little tip, and you can actually use this for speeding up your previews on the timeline as well, is to come up to composition settings. Now the client wants to see this with motion blur on. They don't want to see a sort of unmotion blurred version because there's so much movement going on. It gives you a bit of a strange sense. But you and I both know that rendering without motion blur is much, much quicker, as you can see there. Just looks a little bit strange. So under composition settings, what I'm going to do is come over to advanced. Now, with 2D layers, After Effects automatically uses only as many motion blur iterations as it needs to. And that's what this adaptive sample limit means. That means at the very most it will use 125. It will never go above that. But beyond that, it will adapt according to the nature of the movement in the animation. However, After Effects doesn't do that for 3D layers. For 3D layers, the number of samples per frame is fixed, and it's fixed here at this level of 32. Now, I know that if I type in 8 instead of 32, 8 is a quarter of 32, our rendering time to render this 3D layers animation is going to be about a quarter of the time. And as you can see, even when the thing is moving pretty fast, 8 layers does the trick. Okay, we're seeing a little bit here. And I could even go down, if the client is really pressing and really wants this as fast as possible, I could go down to 4 here, and we would still get a sense of the motion blur, but with a render that takes a fraction of the time. Let's just try it from here where it's moving at its fastest. There you go, it's really whirling around there. And you can see the iterations, but you can get the feeling of the motion blur fine. There you go. So we could render that out like that. We just come to our render queue, File, Scripts, Background Renderer, off we go, and that's going to cook in the background. And as soon as we get our first frames, that will start to appear in the versioner. We'll come back and check that in a second. So there you go, that's cooking away. We're already up to frame 160. Let's just pop into our versioner, edit, purge all. There you go, you can see that our new colour is already popping up in there. And as soon as that's finished, we will be ready to render out a new version for our client with the old Photo JPEG 75, 64360. And overwriting that one. Hey presto, new client version. Okay, last couple of things left to show you. And the main one, I suppose, is the After Effects rendering preferences. Before you go for your kind of main final render, the chances are you just want to have a little look at how these things are set up. There's two which pertain to rendering. The first one is media and disk cache, and the second one is memory and multiprocessing. So let's just have a little look at media and disk cache first. Okay, well in media and disk cache, the main thing is to have disk cache enabled. Now I would choose a fast hard drive if you can, and go on, be generous. I mean, hard disk space is pretty cheap these days. I've got 15 gigabytes there, which is going to sort of help the process out. Now, memory and multiprocessing, this is a little bit of a different one. In CS5, I'd recommend you have it on the whole time. In CS4, I would recommend to have it off while you're working and previewing, and on while you're rendering. It improves the render speed, but there is an overhead when previewing of 10-15 seconds or so, which can be a little bit annoying in CS4 and below. Now, how you have this set up is very much dependent on your system. The main thing to notice is that For each processor you use, you should leave quite a large chunk of RAM. I recommend, generally speaking, going for the top one, 2.09 gigs per CPU. Not only that, you should also leave a significant amount of RAM for the rest of your system and your other applications to run on. Always leave a little bit of buffer space. Now you'll see that on my system I have 16 installed CPUs. That's actually 8 physical CPUs, but each one is multi-threaded. I've got 16 gigabytes of RAM. And the way that this tallies up, I've decided I want to leave at least 4 gigabytes for my system and other applications, so I'm not sort of maxing the computer out. You know, a quarter of my kind of installed RAM remains for the system. Now coming down here, considering that I want to use 2.09 gigs per processor, and the foreground application, the foreground After Effects application, is going to need 1.1 gigs, it seems a pretty good idea for me to be rendering with 5 CPUs. That means that I've got 11 left for other applications. Now that doesn't mean that only 5 CPUs will be used. That means that 5 instances of the After Effects render engine will be launched. Now each of those instances can use a greater number of processors than one. So by just putting 5 actual CPUs to be used, I'm not actually limiting my computer to use 5 when it's rendering. If I bring up my activity monitor to see the load on the processors, you see that for the most of the time all 16 processors are working at full pelt. Now for my setup, this seems to be a pretty stable sort of setup. How you set this up will of course depend on your system, but if you follow similar sort of guidelines you should find something that works. Now before we leave preferences, I'm just going to show you one other thing, and that is the secret preferences. I'm going to come up here to After Effects Preferences, but before I select one of these options I'm going to hold down the Shift key and come to General. And now when the window opens you'll see there is another option at the bottom called Secret. Why is it secret? I guess because by having these options in here it would be an admission of guilt by After Effects that the After Effects render engine may be less than perfect at managing RAM. Now the only one that I tend to use here is the Purge Every option. I have the feeling, well I'm pretty much certain, that After Effects tends to leak RAM as it renders. That means that it's not automatically able to purge all the RAM that it uses. Well, with this on, we force the purging of the memory every 50 frames. And particularly if you're leaving a computer for a long render and you're going away overnight or something like that, you want to make sure that it's done when you get back. It's a very good idea just to have this setting on. Well, that's pretty much it for the preferences. Now one last little thing, I guess I just ought to cover the various options that people asked for the most out of After Effects. You know, how do I render out an FLV, how do I render out a QuickTime movie for the web, etc, etc. Okay, so I have an FLV setting already, but let's just make a new one to show you how it's done. FLV2 let's call it, and hit edit and change the format to FLV. Well, that's it in a nutshell. There's various options that you can use and various presets and settings and so on. I can't really give you any guidance on this because so much of it depends on the material that you're compressing. How big is it? What are the pixel dimensions? Is there a lot of movement in it, or is it kind of like a talking head kind of thing? All of these things make a huge difference to the kind of settings that you need to use for compression. What I can tell you is that if you're working with a 640 by 360 frame, then generally speaking a bitrate of 1500 kilobits per second is going to be more than enough. The quality settings are sort of speed against quality. I tend to go for quality. And that a VBR, variable bitrate, tends to give better results than a non-variable bitrate. Under the audio, it's basically MP3 that you'll probably be familiar with. And again, you know, the higher the bitrate, the bigger the download and the better the quality. It's that kind of simple. Okay, and the other classic, the QuickTime H.264. QuickTime H.264, new settings for the output module. Edit that. Format is H.264, and under Format Options, make sure it's on Custom, unless you particularly want to export a video for an iPod. And your video options are down here. These ones you can leave alone. I generally, for a sort of 640 by 360 size frame, I will go for a target bitrate of 1.5 megabits per second, and maybe we'll put the maximum up to 2.5. Under audio, AAC at 128 will give you a Pretty good sound quality. 192 is a sort of almost archival kind of sound quality. Hit OK, and just making sure that we are stretching to 640 by 360 in the stretch settings here. We should be ready to go. Now, as you can see, this outputs an MP4, so we'll call it QT640 _ AE. Keep it as MP4, and then hit render. That's it. Let's have a little look at the results. A 6.5 megabyte file, and you can see it seems to be pretty much what the doctor ordered. There you go. Well, that's rendering in After Effects. I hope I've covered everything more or less. It's a lot to squeeze in to half an hour or so. If you've got any questions or any further thoughts, don't hesitate to get in touch. My name's Felt Tips. I suspect we shall meet again someday soon. Thanks for listening. Bye.